There we go. And now I can share the screen. Again, thank you for your patience. Without further ado, let's jump right in. And I'm just going to quickly mention that last time we talked a lot about the art movement that was called the itinerants. And they were the kind of artists that paid a lot of attention to the social issues and the inequality that was around them. That was sort of one of the signature features of the art. They talked a lot about the lower classes, how they're not treated well, and probably one of the most quintessential works by an itinerant is this work called Barge Haulers on the Volga by Ilya Repin, probably Russia's #1 19th century artist. And the plot of the painting is pretty clear. Here, barge haulers were the people who had to pull large ships. They were serfs most of the time, and after the abolishment of serfdom, there were people who were just paid really badly to do this kind of job. The obvious problem with such a job was the fact that when it still existed, there were already much more efficient ways to move large ships like that. But it was just much cheaper. And Ilya Repin, when during one of his trips down the Neva River, he saw what these people had to deal with. He cared deeply about it, and he decided to paint this scene. And he realized that he couldn't do it just from his memory, from the impression that he had, that he needed to actually travel back to the Volga River. And he met a lot of the people that you see in the painting here. Of course, at first, they did not trust him. They did not want to talk to him. But eventually, they became close. He learned about the stories of their lives, the nicknames that they had for each other, and their personalities. And in short, in this painting, he really tried to convey these personalities. However, already towards the second half of the 19th century, the whole idea of this very social art that highlights social problems became very stale, and the artists were growing tired of having to make sure that their art serves some sort of pragmatic purpose, for example, exposes the problems that are in the society. And there were a lot of artists that appeared at that time that wanted to change that. And the first artist that I want to show you kind of introduced the idea of art for art's sake. I'd say again to the Russian audience, the name of this artist was Michael Vrubel, as they say. You probably remember this painting from the cover of our today's stream. And Mikhail Vrubel, he was from a Russian city called Novgorod. That was not Moscow, not St. Petersburg, but Novgorod was one of the cities in Russia with a really long history, the city that existed since ancient Russian times, and a city with really strong folk tradition. And in a lot of ways, Mikhail Vrubel tries to reflect the main themes of the Russian folk tradition, while also combining it with this incredibly beautiful Art Deco style of his art. And so this painting is called The Swan Princess. The Swan Princess is a character from Russian folklore, kind of similar to the Swan Lake fairy tale. It is a woman that turns into a swan. And here Vrubel was able to depict this process of transformation, either from a woman into a swan or vice versa, we can't tell, but you can see that this is you can still see a woman's face and her body, but there are wings coming out of it, and you can really see that beautiful process of transformation. Another wonderful thing that I like about this piece is that we kind of like walk into something something private. We see this really private process of transformation, and the Swan Princess is like staring at us, looking us right in the eye. You know, how dare you watch me transform into a swan like that, which I think is wonderful. And in the late 19th, early 20th century Russia, this kind of look, you know, really pale skin, dark hair, big eyes, dark eyebrows, was one of the beauty ideals. So this is also, you know, the quintessential beauty of that time. And even to this day, I think for a lot of Russian people, this is an example of a beautiful woman. That's what we often think about when we look at that painting. But Rubin didn't only get inspired by folk tales. He also drew inspiration from Russian literature, classic literature. And this painting, it's personally one of my most favorite art pieces. Right, isn't that amazing?
Wow.
It's called The Seated Demon. And it is inspired by a poem of a 19th century Russian poet, Mikhail Lermontov. He worked at this during the time, the age that we call the golden age of Russian literature, so sort of mostly in the first quarter of the 19th century. And the kind of the main idea behind the plot of this poem is the story of the fallen angel, you know, a rebel. But it's also a person who is destined to be alone. In Lermontov's poem, he falls in love with a woman, and it is a story of a tragic love. And Rubin actually painted a series of works inspired by this poem, The Demon. And in some pieces, he is together with that woman that he falls in love with. But in others, and this probably is the most famous one, we can see it at the Tretyakov Gallery in Moscow. In this one, he's all alone, and it is an incredibly thoughtful piece. If you look at it, you can see he's in deep thought. He's looking into the void, and the idea of a lonely hero is one of the main subjects of Lermontov's poetry, a person who is destined to be different and destined to be alone. And Vrubil really reflects this in this work. If you look at the body of the demon, it towers at the very center of the painting, and it looks bigger than the rest of the landscape. The landscape is truly wonderful. The beautiful flowers that you see, this incredible color of the sky behind this piece shows the beauty of the world, but the demon is pictured here in contrast with the rest of the world, which I find incredibly beautiful. And I can't but mention, I have to mention the style, of course, by Michael Rubel, that you probably have already noticed in both of the works. It's a very modern style in terms of the fact that it reminds us of works of some impressionists. It reminds us of works of some post-impressionists. I see a little bit of Van Gogh here in the brush strokes, which are quite volumed and do stick out of the painting. The patches of color might remind us in some ways of works by Monet and Renoir. The color palette has something from Pissarro's work, and it just shows a deeply educated person who was really in tune with what was going on in the world of art. But if Michael Rubel, even though he steps away from this tradition of pointing out the vices of the world that the itinerants had, we can say that the artists that worked after Michael Wrubel took this idea of art for art's sake even further. And around the same time, art movement was created that was called the World of Art movement. It was a group of intellectuals, several artists, both from Moscow and St. Petersburg, that the movement was deeply rooted in aesthetics and in art for art's sake, and a deep admiration of the past and the Western cultures. Again, late 19th, early 20th century in Russia, in a way, can also be characterized by the crisis of aristocracy. As you know, the revolution happened in 1917, and in general, the proletariat and the working class was really fighting for their place in the world. And in a way, this movement, a very refined, a very aesthetically pleasing movement, was in contrast with which was going on in the social life of the country at that time. The difference between the world of art and, say, works by Michael Wrubel that I just showed you, that they almost tried not to put any deep meaning in their paintings and simply just delight in the beauty of art and the beauty of the world around them. For example, here's one of my favorite works by that movement. It's called Supper by Leon Bakst, who, you know, like a lot of other members of the world of art, later immigrated to Europe and made a good career in immigration. But this, if you look at it and see a beautiful woman flirting with you, this is pretty much what Leon Bakst wanted you to see. A beautiful, beautiful eyes, a beautiful voluptuous body, a really playful way with which she's holding a champagne flute and looking at you, and an artist's pure admiration of form. Look at this beautiful hat she's wearing, and the lines that he uses in the painting. The only straight line that you can see is probably the line of the wall. Everything else is flowing. Everything else is really playing with us. And art critics of the time compared this woman to a cat, a playful cat. This was one of the nicknames that the painting had. And as I said, Leon Bakst later immigrated to Europe, and he was working for Ballet Russe. You might have heard of that company in France, headed by Sergei Diaghilev, another prominent Russian artist in a wider sense, great manager, and also a member of the World of Art movement. And one of the biggest things he did there was create theater decorations and costumes. And he's actually not the only artist that we will be talking about today that created wonderful theater decorations and costumes in immigration. As I mentioned, they had a great admiration of the past, and especially one of the artists, whose name was Konstantin Somov, I think was really good at reflecting this very playful, very happy, very giddy mood, and he chose mostly 18th century Europe. A lot of his paintings had to do with France. So this one is this really playful one, a ridiculed kiss. You can see this couple kissing in the at the front of the painting, and other people kind of sneaking up on them on the right. As you can see, they maybe ran away from a party and were trying to have some privacy. They were not able to. And it's probably sort of looks at these stories, 18th century little vignettes, with a certain amount of irony. Maybe laughing at them in a way. So you can say that it's Rococo art, for example. It is very different. It's in a way a deep longing to be there in the 18th century Europe, go back in time and enjoy this really easy life of aristocracy. On another hand, he is making fun of it a little bit here. So basically, to sum it up, this kind of paintings were created for our entertainment. Here's another one, a skating rink in winter. And I think one of the most interesting features of this painting, besides, again, an attempt to show us the beauty of that time that had passed, is also showing us a certain order in the way the scene is arranged. Like, we don't see these people as real people. We see them almost as marionettes, or maybe parts of a bigger ornament, because as you look at it, there's a lot of straight lines. There's a lot of repetition here in the painting, for example, in the trees in the back. And of course, the two central figures have the exact same pose, that is quite unnatural. Again, it shows us the beauty of the time, but at the same time, ridicules it in a way. Alexander Benoit was another wonderful member of that group, and he looked more at the story of Rococo time France, the story of the Sun King. But again, he tried to paint the king and his life in Versailles, maybe from the angles that we haven't thought of before. For example, when we think of Versailles, we think of a beautiful bright garden with gorgeous fountains. But here we see Versailles on a gloomy day, and the king and his courtiers just sort of trying to make it through the rain, being uncomfortable in a lot of ways. This Chinese pavilion piece represents a love triangle. Again, something you could read maybe in a 18th century romantic novel. A couple on the left, a clueless spouse looking for them all around the pavilion. Here is a story from Russian history, Emperor Paul. That's early 19th century. On one hand, we see incredible order, because Emperor Paul was known for his love of order and military drills. On the other hand, we really see nature kind of overpowering what's going on. The most marvelous part of the whole piece is the snow, and not this incredible military parade. Probably my favorite work from the world of art movement is not a painting, is an illustration, also by Alexander Benoit, and it's an illustration to a poem by Alexander Pushkin, probably Russia's most famous poet, known as Bronze Horseman. In short, the idea behind Bronze Horseman is to show how a small person can go insane in a big city without any support. The main character is a simple man who dreams of a very simple life. He finds a woman he wants to marry. He creates a plan of how they're going to live together. But unfortunately, his bride-to-be dies during one of the floods, which in St. Petersburg at that time were quite common. And the thing is, it was Peter the Great's original decision to build the city in this place with very unkind weather. And in a way, by making that decision, Peter the Great sacrificed the lives of ordinary people that would be living in the city. And so the main character goes insane, and he keeps having visions that the Bronze Horseman, the statue of Peter the Great on horseback, keeps following him around. And this is what you can see in this illustration, which I find absolutely delightful. So the world of art movement existed up until 1927, at which point all the artists that were members of the movement moved abroad because the atmosphere in the country was really not favorable to avant-garde artists that were not, in tune with the revolutionary agenda. But another interesting thing about the world of art movement is that they were also publishing an art magazine that was called The World of Art. And they got a lot of sponsorship from great philanthropists of that time. And people who knew the world of art of that time, that magazine was really a very important part of their life. And I will show you one of the covers of that magazine in a little bit. Interestingly enough, some of the artists that were part of the world of art movement did manage to move on and create their own unique styles, and among them was Philip Malyavin. You can see one of his works on your screen now. It's called Whirlwind, and at first it's hard to even distinguish what is depicted in the painting. And this painting is also in the Tretyakov Gallery in Moscow, and when you approach it, it almost looks like an abstract painting. You just see lots of really bright splotches of color, and only later do you notice the heads of the women. You understand that this is just a group of women in Russian folk dress that are dancing together, and that, hence the painting is called Whirlwind. And actually Philippe Malyavin became quite well known in the West and was one of the very first artists who helped move Russian art to the West and showed the art scene in the West that finally Russian artists were able to create something unique, something that wasn't copying the West anymore, but something that was very deeply rooted in our culture. So this painting is truly incredible. But even this kind of work, it might look very refreshing and very new compared to what we saw at the very beginning of our tour, yet another painting by an itinerant artist. Russian artists did not stop there, because the early 20th century was the time in world history where big changes were being made. New technologies were introduced to the market. Things like automobiles appeared, for example. People understood what it's like to move at a very high speed. People witnessed things like a light bulb, that changed the way they lived. They didn't need to rely on the sun anymore to illuminate their dwellings. And things were really changing, and in the minds of a lot of people, both in Russia and really in a lot of other European countries, it meant that the world of art should change too. And I have to say, of all places, in Russia, the times were so turbulent. In 1917, the revolution took place, and all of these changes really got reflected in the world of art. And Russian modern and avant-garde artists, because now we are finally talking about Russian avant-garde. I'm very excited because I've been promising you to talk about them for a while. They all spoke through the language of manifestos and exhibits. And the first such manifesto was called A Slap in the Face of Public Taste. And it was quite a dramatic name, of a new art movement, I have to say. And basically, these artists that were part of this manifesto, who signed it, they believed that art needs to change, and for the world of art to truly develop, we really need to discard all of the old and start everything completely new. So the manifesto that they published, that was called a slap in the face of public taste, they said that we need to say no to Pushkin and Leo Tolstoy, for example. We need to just, and that is a quote, we need to throw them off the ship of modern time. There's no place for the old art on the ship of modern time. And so this manifesto was published in a book, and the cover of the book really spoke for itself. You can see how it was brown. Well, actually, the book was covered with the fabric of a real potato sack. So it was really rustic. You can see these red, all caps letters on the cover. That was, when you think about even today, somebody writes you a message in all caps, it sounds like they are yelling at you. And, that's what it felt like to the people of that time. And, the name also was really dramatic, a slap in the face. And I promised to show you one of the covers of the World of Art magazine. Well, here it is on the right. You can see how much more refined and beautiful that is. And so what you see on the right is sort of what the public of that time was used to. What you see on the left is what these new modern artists were offering to the public. This group of artists, they believed that all of art should change, not just painting, not just all of visual art, because we're building a new world, and that was one of the claims of the culture of the Russian Revolution. We need to change everything, and we need to start with our language, really. And so these artists, they did not just create paintings or drawings or graphics, which they also did plenty of, but they also started publishing these new books. And you can see on top, these are the names of some of the members of who signed that manifesto: Alexei Kruchonych and Velimir Khlebnikov. They were writing poetry, and they were creating these books that were very different. For example, you can see a poem on the left, and there are songs of people yelling here. And so the letters are going in all directions, giving us a visual clue of how these people are yelling, which is quite incredible. As you can see, they were playing with fonts, they were playing with the way the lines are located on the page. And they started with art, but of course, as this movement evolved, it did also reflect much more traditional media, such as painting, for example. And one of the major and most important exhibits of these modern artists was called the Jack of Diamonds exhibit. And even the name, the Jack of Diamonds, was supposed to be very, again, really different and contrasting to this culture of refined beauty of aristocrats. It was very low class. It reminded people of a card game, which was something maybe aristocrats were not supposed to do. In Russian culture, it also really correlates to prison jargon and slang. So the people of the time felt a little bit of that too. So and it was truly a rebellion. And the artists who exhibited their works at that exhibition really showed how, first of all, they were very different from what the public was used to, but in some ways they were quite in tune with the Western modern art. This painting, for example, really reminds me of works by Matisse. what can we see here? This is a painting by an artist, Ilya Mashkov. It's a self-portrait and a portrait of his friend, Peter Konchalovsky, who was also an artist, with the subject being quite interesting. So what can you see here? You can see two men at very central. And I have to mention that this painting is huge. It's the same size as the type of paintings that in the classical art would depict, the Last Supper or the Descent from the Cross, the large works by Rubens and Rembrandt. And we see this large painting that is a manifesto in and of itself. So the two men in the center, the artist and his friend, and we can see their beautiful muscular bodies. It became really popular at the time to lift weights, especially among men, doing bodybuilding, so to say, so take care of your physical body. But at the same time, you can see that these two guys that were just lifting weights together and they were wearing sports attire, and you can see kettlebells on the ground. One of them is holding this very elegant violin, and the other one is holding some notes, some music, sheet music. There are these beautiful dainty paintings on the background, a beautifully set table, there's a piano, and on top of the piano there are also these giant tomes, and in Russian they say one of them is the Bible, there's art history, there's Cezanne, it just, on one hand, in this painting, the artist tried to show himself and his friend as a really well-rounded people, both that are beautiful both physically and intellectually and spiritually, but we can't take it very seriously at the same time. This is also a very playful painting and a game in a way, because who plays the violin in just their underwear, right? This is very, very, very unusual. And I think that people definitely did not do that in 1910 when this painting was created. But also there is a certain feeling of just the sensation of enjoyment of life and everything life has to offer. Exercise, beautiful music, beautiful art, great food. And Ilya Mashkov also created beautiful still lifes that convey the same kind of mood, just incredible enjoyment of the simple pleasures of life in a way. So this still life is dedicated to bread, and when I look at it, I can almost smell it. I think this bread is wonderful, and the vibrant colors that he uses definitely can elevate anyone's mood. And Mashkov had similar still lifes with fruit, vegetables, fish, and things like that. Again, just reflecting this idea of enjoying life's simple pleasures. But I think that the true heroes, the most outstanding artists of that time, and if after we're done today, if you wonder, like, what are the most important names that you should remember, I would say these two guys. They were like the power couple of Russian avant-garde. Their names were Mikhail Larionov and Natalia Goncharova. They were both artists. They were both incredibly forward-thinking and had amazing careers. It was one of those examples of a couple where they were both able to shine and create some beautiful art. And of course, personally, I would like to highlight Natalia Goncharova, because she's the first woman of Russian avant-garde, and she is the first female artist, the female Russian artist that became known in the West. You can see their portraits here, and I believe that they truly were pioneers of Russian avant-garde, and they pioneered other forms of art, not just painting, but such media as body art, for example. And you can see the portrait of Natalia, a photo of Natalia Goncharova, who painted something on her face. On one hand, this is an attempt to show us a new nature of art, because she created this work of art and then she's going to easily wash it off her face and this artwork is gone. On the other hand, this was also part of a performance. So Goncharova and Larionov and some other artists in that Jack of Spades group, sorry, Jack of Diamonds group pioneered performance art. So they would paint their faces and go out into the public, to the shock, to everyone's shock, because this was incredibly unconventional at that time. Or they would go out wearing suits, but instead of handkerchiefs, they would have super bright red spoons, wooden spoons, sticking out of their pockets. So, and that was, again, really unheard of, and it shocked everybody. And I absolutely admire Natalia Goncharova. And after our talk today, I recommend that you check out this article that was created by Tate Modern. It's an article and the video. So if you Google Tate Modern Natalia Goncharova or introducing Natalia Goncharova, it will come up. And they created this beautiful video talking about her life. And it's a very good article about her and her life. So I highly recommend that you check that out. I see something in the chat. Yes, I am recording this, so if you are missing any of it, you will be able to see the rest later. And the first bullet point in the article is that Natalia Goncharova was the pioneer of everything-ism. What is everything-ism? It was something that they incorporated in their art, is the idea that you can use everything in your art. You can be inspired by the world around you, and the most trivial things, such as, for example, advertisement or posters, in shop windows. But at the same time, you can get inspired by religious subjects. You can get inspired by folk tales. And Natalia Goncharova really shows that in her art. And I want to show you a couple pieces created by her that really illustrate how various she was in her works. One of the things that the Jack of Diamonds movement and artists did, they worked in a style for a while that was called cubic futurism. And the idea was that those pieces combined some elements of cubism. You can see that in this painting. There is definitely an element of looking at something from different angles, right? Like even the street here, you can see it. Here's from one point of view, the little vent we're looking at from above, and futurism, which was a movement that started in Italy that really glorified the idea of movement and speed. And I absolutely love this piece that is called Cyclist, because I think it is one of the best ways that speed has been conveyed in art. So the cyclist is going forward on his bike, and in the painting, you can see basically everything that catches his eye, right? You can see parts of shop names, posters. You can see the ground from different angles. And of course, you can see the cyclist himself moving. And this is an incredibly dynamic and vibrant piece. So this is an example of one thing that she did. At the same time, she also created pieces that look like this. And these pieces were inspired, of course, by traditional Russian icons. Thinking back to our very first meeting this year, I showed you some pieces by Andrei Rublev. The thing is, when you and I were looking at these pieces by Andrei Rublev. They are beautifully restored and maintained by modern curators. But in the early 20th century, that was actually done for the first time. And artists, people who cared about art, got to see these beautiful pieces from a new light for the very first time. They lived their whole life thinking that icons are incredibly dark and dull. And all of a sudden, when all of these layers of dirt were cleaned off of the icons, they saw the beautiful, bright, vibrant colors that these icons were actually painted with. And so Goncharova and Larionov and some other artists in that movement created a lot of very religious art. However, that was not well perceived by the church, by the public of that time, considered blasphemy. But here, for example, this wonderful piece from the Russian Museum is actually 4 separate, really long paintings that take up almost the whole wall and give us a new view on icons, the new view of religion. It's an attempt to view, these centuries old stories and personas from a new light and through the lens of modern art. Mikhail Larionov, again, look at the self-portrait. It's incredibly clear that this is also inspired by Russian icon painting, with the colors, with the perspective, for the lack of a better word, lack of volume that we can see in this painting. And this is quite an arrogant piece, one might say, thinking of you as a saint that could be in a painting. But Larionov was a hooligan of art, as Russians say. And at that Jack of Diamonds exhibit, these were some of the pictures that he presented to the public. They were very primitivist in a way that might remind us of the French artist Rousseau, except they were really inspired by the life, again, of the ordinary people around him, soldiers, waitresses, and sometimes it could be barbers, for example. And he paints them in this really primitive style that was supposed to shock the public, and nothing escapes his eye. Even little pictures that somebody scribbled on the wall, they end up in the picture. These kind of paintings, it was a series he created for 4 seasons, were inspired. And you can see this is sort of everything-ism at its core, because I mean, this could be inspired by folk pictures that we call lubok in Russian, basically folk Russian graphics that people in Russian villages would have in their homes to decorate their humble dwellings. It could be inspired by children's drawings, and the way that he writes, he added little poems in each painting. Those are very naive poems, and the way it's written, for me personally, it reminds me of a way that like a young school child would write, especially in the early 20th century, back in the day when everybody had to try to write in cursive. This is what it reminds me of. But one of the ways I think that Goncharova and Larionov were especially remarkable is that they pioneered their own movement of abstract art that they called rayonism. And it again was connected with the rays of spirituality at the time, but also with some scientific inventions, such as, for example, the invention of X-rays. The idea behind rayonism was to show the rays that can be seen around different objects. And earlier in their journey, Larionov and Goncharova depicted rays of less abstract object. For example, in this one, you can sort of discern a rooster. They did a Rayonist sausage and a mackerel. There's one where you see a piece of sausage with rays going out of it. But eventually, in their career, they moved towards more abstract works and truly pioneered abstract painting in Russia. The person who is truly known as the creator of abstract painting is, of course, Vasily Kandinsky. He created his first abstract piece, if I'm not mistaken, in 1910. But he was in Germany at that time. He was not in Russia. So it was Goncharova and Larionov who pioneered abstract painting in Russia. But of course, we have to at least mention Vasily Kandinsky today because he was Russian and he is known around the world as the father of abstract art. And you can see one of his pieces here. In his memoirs, Kandinsky mentioned, and he was not an artist by trade, by the way, he was a lawyer, but he mentioned his first encounter with a painting by Monet, one of his haystacks. And he remembered looking at the haystacks and thinking how these are not haystacks at all. These are depictions of haystacks, but really a number of brushstrokes, a picture that is expressed through form and color. And if a painting makes you feel a certain way, it's really not the subject of the painting. It is, it's not the subject of the painting, it's the form and the color that you see. And if the form and the color is what makes us feel a certain way when we look at the painting, do we really need subject at all? And so he starts experimenting with just using form and color to convey certain moods. And Kandinsky is known by getting really inspired by music when he depicts his works. His art is very synthetic, and he himself could really, he would say that when looking at a painting, you could almost tell what it smells like, what it sounds like, what it feels like, just by looking at a painting. So this is Kandinsky in a nutshell. But today I wanted to talk more about Kazimir Malevich, because he did work in Russia, and he moved abstract art to a whole new level. Of course, you have probably heard of his most famous piece, the quintessential work of Russian avant-garde, which is the Black Square. And today I just want to talk about how he got to the Black Square. He didn't just come up with it out of the blue. It all started with an opera. Malevich was, I have to say, before the creation of the Black Square and all of these endeavors, just a very active member of the Russian world of art at that time. He was painting together with all the artists that I mentioned earlier. He was also going out and doing different performances in the public. And eventually he wrote this futurist opera that was called Victory Over the Sun. And what you can see on your screens right now are some of the costumes for the opera. And it is known that the costumes were incredibly uncomfortable. The plot of the opera was incredibly hard to understand. And the music was also really hard to play. You can see a picture of a modern adaptation of this opera, because they still do play it. And if you search Victory Over the Sun on YouTube, you will be able to find what the opera looks like. What does the Victory Over the Sun mean? This name has multiple meanings, but ultimately at its core, it's the same Futurist manifesto that we talked about earlier. It's the victory of the new over the old. And the sun really symbolizes, on one hand, traditional Russian art in its broad sense. You know, we often say the golden age of Russian art or the golden age of Russian poetry. Sometimes some of the artists that created at that time were known as the sun of Russian art or the sun of Russian poetry. So it's the victory over the classical art. At the same time, it is also the victory over forces of nature, and a sun as an agent of nature. As I said, people were incredibly impressed by the fact that now, with the creation of the light bulb, we don't have to rely on the sun anymore to provide us with light. We, the modern people, can now live in this whole new way, and we proclaim our victory over the sun. And so one of the decorations of the opera was this piece here, a very abstract depiction of victory over the sun. This little white triangle here is the sun, and it gets covered by, you know, the force of the dark, and evolves into the notorious black square at an exhibition that took place in 1915 in Petrograd or St. Petersburg. The exhibition was called 010, and we don't know for sure what 010 means. We can only interpret the name, but most likely 0 is nothing and 10 is everything, or 0 is the old, 10 is the new. The idea behind the exhibit had a lot to do with the new art movement and art philosophy that Kandinsky proposes, that Malevich proposes. The idea behind it was that in order to be completely done with the old, we need to return to the absolute nothing and start with the new from there. The absolute nothing, in terms of Kandinsky's art, is the black square. And at that exhibit, the painting of the black square, as you can see, hangs also in a very interesting way. It's right in the corner. And it's not just any corner. This is what is known the red corner in a Russian house. So this would be the corner in a home where people would hang the most important icon. And instead of an icon, Kandinsky slaps there a picture of black square, the ultimate nothing from which we are going to build the new way. And you can see other paintings on the walls here. Some are paintings of various shapes. And once Kandinsky gets to the black square and does decide to build a new world, he creates pieces that are filled with different beautiful colors, but are all about this play with the shape and form. Kandinsky later moves on to design because he believes that art greatly affects the life of people, and because we are the people of the new world who got to nothing, and then from nothing we're going to rebuild the new life. So he starts designing clothes, dishes, furniture, interiors for the people who would live in this new world. And this is ultimately probably the quintessential Russian avant-garde, which unfortunately from then on went downhill. In the middle of the 20th century in Russia, a completely different school of art started proliferating, known as social realism, which would be probably the subject of our next lecture. In the meantime, I'm absolutely happy to answer your questions. Please feel free to put them in the chat and I will answer. While you're typing, I just wanted to thank you again for your patience and thank you for joining me today, for joining me for the last several lectures that were dedicated to Russian art. So thank you, and thank you for your flexibility and joining me on Zoom. Thank you so much for your positive comments. I appreciate it. I know Russian avant-garde and Russian art is underrated in a way and not as well known as European art, I think, among people. So I'm glad you learned a lot. Thank you, Elaine, so much for your wonderful comments. Ooh, a wonderful comment that Natalia Goncharova's work reminded you of Frida Kahlo's style. I've never thought of it this way, but I do know Frida Kahlo possibly could have seen works by Natalia Goncharova because both Natalia Goncharova and her husband moved to Paris later in life. They also got invited by Ballet Russe to design costumes and decorations. And once they went there to work they never returned back to Russia. And so for the rest of their career, they worked in mostly France, but in general in the West. And I know that Natalia Goncharova also taught art, and she taught it a lot to Americans. I know that Frida Kahlo was not American, but I'm just saying that her works became known even outside of Europe as well. So there is a chance Frida Kahlo could have seen those works. Thank you so much. On that note, I want to thank you one more time for your flexibility, for joining me today. This is being recorded, and I will be sharing the recording with the rest of the audience. But thank you for making this possible and for making it happen. Have a wonderful rest of your weekend, and I will see you next month. Thank you.